Hello and welcome to the Castle Talk podcast, where we talk to writers and creators of today's genre worlds. From Denver, Colorado, I'm your host, Jason Henderson, author of the Alex Van Helsing series from HarperCollins. Tonight, director Ed Gass-Donnelly is the director of The Last Exorcism Part 2 and Small Town Murder Songs, and his new film is Lavender, a horror film about a photographer, Abbie Cornish, who suffers severe memory loss after a traumatic traffic accident, which is like a crazy scene in the movie. Strange clues amongst her photos suggest she may be responsible for the deaths of her family members, and so her psychiatrist, played by Justin Long, suggests that she goes back to the old house and rediscover her forgotten past. It is a very psychological thriller. I think Ed, you don't even call it a horror film. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you very much. All right, so just to dive right into it, I wanted to say, in watching Lavender, I've already seen it. You have this opening that does this really interesting thing where the camera is panning around a farmhouse crime scene, and it just reminded me so much of like In Cold Blood, and it looks like you're looking at 3D Polaroids. How did you? It's a very creative, interesting way to do a scene that we've seen 1,000 times before. How did you come up with this?
Well, it was always, one of the keys in figuring out, because this movie was something that we'd been developing for a while, and we couldn't quite get it going, because we always, often in these kinds of films, it's like, why now? Like, why is the protagonist dealing with these problems now? And once we made her a photographer sort of searching for, sort of obsessed with photographing old farmhouses, and she pretty quickly discovers, this one in particular, and finds out that she actually owns that farmhouse, that felt like the engine that was driving the movie. So right from the very beginning, when we sort of first see glimpses of this crime scene, I felt like I wanted to I love the idea of memories being photographs, and same with the idea that the idea of a ghost being like a moment frozen in time, like a photograph. And is this a movie about the idea of a haunting being sort of psychologically haunted, or is it supernaturally haunted, or is there even a difference? What is the idea of a ghost? And so all of those ideas were sort of swirling in our heads. So I really wanted to sort of take us, the viewer, on sort of through these sort of frozen moments of time that were her memories, and in a kind of poor man's Matrix bullet time sequence.
But it works beautifully. I mean, you really do feel like you're moving through photographs from in this case, the 1980s, although the 80s, in a farm look like the 50s. Like I say, it has right, that, yeah, In Cold Blood feel to it. I love that you created this character, that she's into photographing houses. We in the first act, we establish Abbie Cornish, who is a very classic sort of Hitchcockian blonde, that her thing is that she drives around, and if she spots an old house that looks abandoned, she gets out and takes pictures of it. That is a cool setup, and it was very creative.
Thank you.
She even says that houses are like epitaphs, which is such an interesting thing. Do you remember that line, and do you know why she calls them epitaphs?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's like when she says that. I mean, one of the things I think is cool about the movie, and I think it's not groundbreaking, but is I think always effective, is that when you start dealing with a character that has missing memories, it really places the audience and the character on equal footing. Like, we're both trying to, they don't know more information than we do, and we don't know more than she does. So we're both kind of exploring this at the same time. So, of course, when she says that, she sort of means it in earnest, in that she sees these abandoned old buildings. And I guess I always loved the idea of, when you see a photograph, and it conjures so many questions, who lived there and who were they? And, of course, we're about to find out a bunch of that information, about 10 minutes after that scene occurs in the film. But, sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's always just something that I always found just personally interesting. Of when you driving, frankly, it's probably while location scouting, I'm like, who owns this property? This thing looks like a bomb hit it 50 years ago. What's happened to the people? What happened to the place? You start seeing these. I remember when I was shooting Last X in New Orleans, and it was years after Katrina, but still you'd have these buildings that just sort of were sitting there is these almost like giant corpses on the street, reminding you of what happened not that long ago. And I think that's just personally fascinating.
I'm fascinated by rural ruins. I mean, and I really wanted to know, where are you filming? I mean, where were these houses that she's going to?
It's like rural Ontario, so it's about like an hour outside of Toronto.
Oh, I see. All right. Very cool. I mean, it could have been Texas. It could have been Georgia. There's a,
Yeah,
it's,
Toronto. That kind of our landscape up here. I mean, at least that part, it doubles for. Well, it doubles for a lot of American cities because a lot of American movies shoot up here. But it does have that. Yeah, there's certain parts of the state it definitely feels not like, but like you're not going to get mountains or anything like that really up here. But yeah, that rural quality it feels.
hmm
You could. And having shot in Georgia too. I mean, there's parts of it that are obviously very, very different. And the weather is certainly, well, summer it is actually pretty darn hot, but although it is a
Yeah.
balmy, I don't know Fahrenheit, but it's pretty darn warm for February right now up here.
There's when she finds the house that brings back a lot of her memories, it turns out that she owns. You've got Dermot Mulroney plays her uncle, and he explains that they've been growing corn, and so you have a lot of these scenes where characters wade out into this like 3 foot of corn, which is just really cool looking because we're accustomed to seeing corn stalks at their full height, but here you have this gorgeous sort of field of green, and all of these scenes I think you talked about took place in daytime. Can you talk a little bit about playing with the staging of a farm for like these visions and ghosts and whatever it is that she's seeing?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is hardest to do about a genre movie is the accidental influence of your subconscious from your own pop culture experiences. So you might think you're being really original or you're sort of going for a vibe and you start realizing you're accidentally ripping off something that just is in your mind from your childhood. So, for example,
Yeah.
yes, the one that you're talking about being the most familiar with, like tall, they show them more dead corn stalks. I mean, there's a scene in the movie that was written to be a corn maze, and all that stuff happens in the fall, which is frankly when we were originally going to shoot the film. And
Right.
with Abbie's schedule, she wasn't available then, so we started looking at spring. And of course, although a couple of farmers told us, "Oh, the corn will be 6 feet high," and of course it's like 3 feet high. But
Right.
there was a choice, and we knew as we were going into this, like we had to embrace it, and rather than trying to force. And I actually found that actually suddenly made us abandon. I was like, oh, the only reason I was going for this particular aesthetic is because I, Children of the Corn, or I'd seen the
Sure.
signs. But I actually found it much more exciting and interesting to how do we make these lush green, rich colors and this
Yeah.
palette feel creepy? And then that really triggered a whole change to our approach. We didn't set a whole bunch of scenes in daytime instead of nighttime, and tried to make the things that are beautiful actually strange, disconcerting, and creepy. And
Yeah.
so there was something really interesting about being wading out into like the corn, like it is like you're like wading into the ocean, where it's this vast space all around you, and there's still a threat in that something could hide on the ground, but it's not. You're not lost the same way you are if you walk into like a 7 foot, 8 foot tall cornfield.
No, but it's still unnerving because, like you said, your lower legs are submerged, in this corn. Uh, there was another thing I really wanted to ask you about. There's a scene, and I won't spoil what's going on, but there's a scene where you have a young actress unconscious and wake up in a really shocking, scary situation, and this is towards the end of the film. And what I wanted to know is when you have a kid that you're, in this case, there's a lot of blood or there's a lot of whatever. How do you? It seems like it would be very sensitive to try to get this 12-year-old or whatever she is to to be in a situation that would traumatize adults if it were real. So,
Yeah,
can you talk a little bit about that process?
I'm trying to remember how old she was. Actually, I think even like, was she 10? She's remarkable, that kid, Peyton Kennedy, and she. I mean, the scene. So it's funny. Like, there's a little anecdote you're going to miss is she's great in that scene, but that's actually the second take. And the first take of that scene, she opens her eyes and like tears just start streaming down her face, and like she's just like just amazing. And I'm like, oh my God, cut, we nailed it. Oh, that's so awesome. And then it was actually Justin Long who quietly comes and taps me on the shoulder. He's like, she's like, dude, she was so good, but it's like, if she was able to express all that emotion, would she be as would she have be as shell shocked as she needs to be in order to like justify what the rest of the movie? And he was totally right. But I was just so blown away by this kid that had just delivered. Well, I can't even take credit for it. I can't be like, oh, I gave her the best direction in the world. Like, I set up a very simple scenario, but like, he just like hit it out of the park. but for the wrong, it set up the wrong
Sure.
journey. So we did a second take, and she's still amazing. It set the right tone, and it was just Brendan, who's my cinematographer. We were just both so sort of awestruck that we were like, just ready to move on, even though it would have been wrong for the movie. So it's funny because when you get like so blown away by something a kid can do, he can actually catch you off guard to the point where you're like, "Wow, that was amazing. Is that right for the movie? I don't know, but you are amazing." And it's funny in terms of anything. Like there was scenes. I mean, they were all they loved being like. They wanted to get like more blood on them. They wanted to get. There was a scene where they had to have a. He ended up making the final cut of the movie, but at one point there was going to be like a live centipede that had to crawl over her hand and up her arm, and we were like, well, are we going to do it CGI maybe? And she's like, no, put real bugs on me, put the bugs on me. And I was like, oh my god, like it's just so funny. What so
the
you think you're trying to be all sensitive and look out for these kids, and meanwhile, like for them it's like a jungle gym and they just want to play.
That's interesting. Okay, so yeah. I mean, as an adult, you're so creeped out by things, but the kid is basically, they're throwing themselves into it because it's play acting and
exactly. I think it's a little bit of like it's Halloween. There's a sense of pretend and play and like a bug. I think they also feel like there's a safety net. Like they wouldn't even know that a centipede could bite you, but of course we have like you have a bug wrangler that actually like gasses the centipedes and puts like a tiny like thing on their teeth. Like it's a whole like there's a whole like if you ever see like I have found this fascinating because if you see a movie and there's somebody like I don't know a tarantula or like a scorpion on someone's body, you're like, well, what beyond it just being creepy, like what happens if they try and sting the person? And so they actually do have to things where they basically gas them, it drugs them, so they knock them out, and they basically essentially they kind of like use a glue stick or not glue stick like a what do you call it? Like a glue gun.
Like a popsicle stick.
Like a really tiny, fine, to like, for example, you have to know the anatomy. They're like, if you put a tiny drop of it here, it'll stop the little part of the mandible coming out that injects the poison. Like, it's crazy. These guys are nuts. Like, I just found that
so strange
we were
that
playing with like very simple bugs. But he was talking about how he's done shows where, if you start thinking of like, Indiana Jones or something like that, where you've got all these bugs all over somebody, especially when you knew they weren't going to be CGI. I've always wondered, like, how do you prevent them from stinging people to death? And that's how.
Well, no, absolutely. I mean,
I'm sorry to cut in.
Yeah.
We're actually almost
2 minutes
up
over
on
time.
So
okay, don't worry. I'll cut this out. All right, so let me wrap this up. Ed Gass-Donnelly, I really appreciate you spending time with me talking about Lavender. It's a very creepy film. I enjoyed it a lot. By the way, the music is gorgeous and very shining, suggestive, and so I think there's a lot here. We will be sure and post the trailer when we post the review on bleedingcool.com. Have a fantastic day, and I really appreciate you spending time with me.
Thanks so much. I'm glad you did the movie.
You bet. Bye.